the generation that followed did not have the same concerns, none of its members attempted to follow the example of the past generation. There was no longer anyone with the noble determination to get to know the great men of the world, or if there were some individuals consumed with this curiosity, they were few in number. From then on, there remained only vulgar minds given over to hatred, envy, and discord, who took an interest only in things which did not concern them, gossip, slander, calumny of one's neighbors, all those things which are the source of the worst of our troubles. Cheikh Anta Diop, Pre-Colonial Black Africa. Cheikh Anta Diop, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality. Supported by the governing powers of all the Western countries, this ideology, based on a moral and intellectual swindle, easily won out over the true scientific current developed by a parallel group of Egyptologists of goodwill, whose intellectual uprightness and even courage cannot be stressed sternly enough. The new Egyptological ideology, born at the opportune moment, reinforced the theoretical basis of imperialist ideology. That is why it easily drowned out the voice of science, by throwing the veil of falsification over historical truth. This ideology was spread with the help of considerable publicity and taught the world over, because it alone had the material and financial means for its own propagation. Thus imperialism, like the prehistoric hunter, first killed the being spiritually and culturally, before trying to eliminate it physically. The negation of the history and intellectual accomplishments of black Africans was cultural, mental murder which preceded and paved the way for their genocide here and there in the world. Cheikh Anta Diop, Civilization or Barbarism, an Authentic Anthropology. Only a loyal, determined struggle to destroy cultural aggression and bring out the truth, whatever it may be, is revolutionary and consonant with real progress. It is the only approach which opens onto the universal. Humanitarian declarations are not called for and add nothing to real progress. In the Nile Valley, civilization resulted from man's adaptation to that particular milieu. As declared by the ancients and by the Egyptians themselves, it originated in Nubia. This is confirmed by our knowledge that the basic elements of Egyptian civilization are neither in Lower Egypt, nor in Asia, nor in Europe, but in Nubia and the heart of Africa. Moreover, that is where we find the animals and plants represented in hieroglyphic writing. If modern civilization should disappear today, but leave libraries untouched, survivors could open almost any book and perceive immediately that persons living south of the Sahara are called blacks. The term Black Africa would suffice to indicate the habitat of the black race. Nothing similar is found in Egyptian texts. Whenever the Egyptians use the word black, Kem, it is to designate themselves or their country, Kemet, land of the blacks. Cheikh Anta Diop, Civilization ou Barbarie. In the Lake Debo region, in Mali, on the Niger, pyramids are also found, and these were dubbed mounds, as might be expected. This is the usual procedure in the attempt to disparage African values. In contrast, there is the reverse procedure consisting of describing a clay tumulus, a real mound in Mesopotamia, as the most perfect temple that the human mind can imagine. It goes without saying that such reconstructions are generally mere wishful thinking. Humanity's moral conscience progresses, slowly yet surely. Cheikh Anta Diop, Black Africa, the economic and cultural basis for a federated state. If the African anthropologist made a point of examining European races under the magnifying glass, he would be able to multiply them ad infinitum by grouping physiognomies into races and subraces as artificially as his European counterpart does with regard to Africa. He would, in turn, succeed in dissolving collective European reality into a fog of insignificant facts. Until now, 1960, date of the first edition, the history of Black Africa has always been written with dates as dry as laundry lists, and no one has almost ever tried to find the key that unlocks the door to the intelligence, the understanding of African society. One in the Nile Valley, civilization resulted from man's adaptation to that particular milieu. As declared by the ancients and by the Egyptians themselves, it originated in Nubia. This is confirmed by our knowledge that the basic elements of Egyptian civilization are neither in Lower Egypt, nor in Asia, nor in Europe, but in Nubia and the heart of Africa. Moreover, that is where we find the animals and plants represented in hieroglyphic writing. Cheikh Anta Diop quote, "Humanity's moral conscience progresses, slowly yet surely." 00. 2. Humanity's moral conscience progresses, slowly yet surely. Cheikh Anta Diop quote, "Only a loyal, determined struggle to destroy cultural aggression and bring out the truth, whatever it may be, is revolutionary and consonant with real progress. It is the only approach which opens onto the universal. Humanitarian declarations are not called for and add nothing to real progress." 00. 3. Only a loyal, determined struggle to destroy cultural aggression and bring out the truth, whatever it may be, is revolutionary and consonant with real progress. It is the only approach which opens onto the universal. Humanitarian declarations are not called for and add nothing to real progress. Cheikh Anta Diop quote, "Yet the documents at our disposal allow us to do that practically without any break in continuity for a period of 2,000 years, at least insofar as West Africa is concerned. Therefore, it had become indispensable to unfreeze, in a manner of speaking to defossilize that African history which was there at hand, lifeless, imprisoned in the documents." 00. 4. Yet the documents at our disposal allow us to do that practically without any break in continuity for a period of 2,000 years, at least insofar as West Africa is concerned. Therefore, it had become indispensable to unfreeze, in a manner of speaking to defossilize that African history which was there at hand, lifeless, imprisoned in the documents. Cheikh Anta Diop quote, "If the African anthropologist made a point of examining European races under the magnifying glass, he would be able to multiply them ad infinitum by grouping physiognomies into races and subraces as artificially as his European counterpart does with regard to Africa. He would, in turn, succeed in dissolving collective European reality into a fog of insignificant facts." 00. 5. If the African anthropologist made a point of examining European races under the magnifying glass, he would be able to multiply them ad infinitum by grouping physiognomies into races and subraces as artificially as his European counterpart does with regard to Africa. He would, in turn, succeed in dissolving collective European reality into a fog of insignificant facts. There are no fruitful speculations outside of reality. Pharaoh Chephren, circa 2600 BC, 4th dynasty, who built the second Giza pyramid. Egypt's prestige abroad was so intact that the king of Tyre declared, "All industries came from Egypt and all sciences first shone forth there." Cf. Pyrrhon, 2, 505. More importantly, he has applied this encyclopedic knowledge to his researches on African history. While pursuing this research, he told the First International Congress of Black Writers and Artists in September 1956, "We have come to discover that the ancient pharaonic Egyptian civilization was undoubtedly a Negro civilization." To defend this thesis, anthropological, ethnological, linguistic, historical, and cultural arguments have been provided. To judge their validity, it suffices to refer to nations en-agress et culture. Diop's work has posed questions about cultural bias in scientific research for Cheikh Anta Diop University, formerly known as the University of Dakar, in Dakar, Senegal, is named after him. 5-6. Born in Thiétou, Diarbil region, Senegal, Diop belonged to an aristocratic Muslim Wolof family in Senegal where he was educated in a traditional Islamic school. Diop's family was part of the Mouride Brotherhood, the only independent Muslim fraternity in Africa. According to Diop 10, he obtained the colonial equivalent of the Metropolitan French Baccalaureate copyright in Senegal before moving to Paris to study for a degree 11. In 1946, At the age of 23, Diop went to Paris to study. He initially enrolled to study higher mathematics, but then enrolled to study philosophy in the Faculty of Arts of the University of Paris. He gained his first degree, license, in philosophy in 1948, then enrolled in the Faculty of Sciences, receiving 2 diplomas in chemistry in 1950. Diop believed that the political struggle for African independence would not succeed without acknowledging the civilizing role of the African. Dating from ancient Egypt 22, he singled out the contradiction of the African historian who evades the problem of Egypt. 22. In 1960, upon his return to Senegal, he continued what would be a lifelong political struggle. Diop would in the course of over 25 years found 3 political parties that formed the major opposition in Senegal. The first, Le Bloc de Masses SA Copyright Na Copyright Galaise, BMS, was formed in 1961. By 1962, Diop's party, working on the ideas enumerated in Black Africa, the economic and cultural basis for a federated state, became a serious threat to the regime of then-President La Copyright Paul Senghor. Diop was subsequently arrested and thrown in jail, where he nearly died. The party was shortly thereafter banned for opposing Senghor's efforts to consolidate power in his own hands. 23. Black Africa, the economic and cultural basis for a federated state, is the book that best expresses Diop's political aims and objectives. In it he argues that only a united and federated African state will be able to overcome underdevelopment. He proposed that a single African language be used across the continent for official, educational, and cultural purposes. 24. This critical work constitutes a rational study of not only Africa's cultural, historic, and geographic unity, but of Africa's potential for energy development and industrialization. Diop argues for the need to build a capable continental army, able to defend the continent and its people, and proposes a plan for the development of Africa's raw materials and industrialization. All these factors combined, based on the formation of a federated and unified Africa, culturally and otherwise, are surmised to be the only way for Africa to become the power in the world that she should rightfully be. 25. After the BMS was dissolved, Diop and other former members reconstituted themselves under a new party, the Front National SA Copyright Na Copyright Galaise, FNS, in 1963. The party, though not officially recognized, continued strong political activity along the same lines as the BMS. Under significant political pressure, President Senghor attempted to appease Diop by offering him and his supporters a certain numbers of government positions. Diop strongly refused to enter into any negotiations until 2 conditions were met. First, that all political prisoners be released, and, secondly, that discussions be opened on government ideas and programs, not on the distribution of government posts. In protest at the refusal of the Senghor administration to release political prisoners, Diop remained largely absent from the political scene from 1966 to 1975. 25. Cheikh Anta Diop University Library Building, Dakar. After 1960, Diop went back to Senegal and continued his research and political career. He established and was the director of the radiocarbon laboratory at the IFAN, Institut Fondamental de l'Afrique Noire. Diop dedicated a book about the IFAN radiocarbon laboratory to the memory of my former professor Copyright Rick Joliot, who welcomed me into his laboratory at the Collège de France. 26. After his death, the university was named in his honor, Cheikh Anta Diop University of Dakar. He had said, "In practice it is possible to determine directly the skin color and, hence, the ethnic affiliations of the ancient Egyptians by microscopic analysis in the laboratory. I doubt if the sagacity of the researchers who have studied the question has overlooked the possibility." 27. Diop published his technique and methodology for a melanin dosage test in the Bulletin of Institut Fondamental d'Afrique Noire 28-29 in the July 1973 paper entitled La pigmentation des anciens et per thousand Egyptians. Test par la ma copyright Lanin. Diop described the technique used to determine the melanin content of Egyptian mummies. 30-31. Some critics have argued that Diop's melanin dosage test technique lacks sufficient evidence. They contend the test is inappropriate to apply to ancient Egyptian mummies, due to the effects of embalming and deterioration over time. 32. Diop's first work translated into English, The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, was published in 1974. It gained a much wider audience for his work. He asserted that archaeological and anthropological evidence supported his view that pharaohs were of Negroid origin. Some scholars draw heavily from Diop's groundbreaking work, while others in the Western academic world do not accept his theories. 37. Diop's work has posed important questions about the cultural bias inherent in scientific research. 4. Diop argued above all that European archaeologists before and after the decolonization had understated and continued to understate the extent and possibility of black civilization. Citation needed. The Swiss archaeologist Charles Bonnet's discoveries at the site of Kermish shed some light on the theories of Diop. They show close cultural links between Nubia and ancient Egypt, though the relationship had been acknowledged for years. 38. This does not necessarily imply a genetic relationship, however. Mainstream Egyptologists such as F. Urco note that among peoples outside Egypt, the Nubians were closest ethnically to the Egyptians, shared the same culture in the pre-dynastic period, and used the same pharaonic political structure. 39. He suggests that the peoples of the Nile Valley were one regionalized population, sharing a number of genetic and cultural traits. 40. Diop argued that there was a shared cultural continuity across African peoples that was more important than the varied development of different ethnic groups shown by differences among languages and cultures over time. 3. Importance of ancient civilizations. Diop supported his arguments with references to ancient authors such as Herodotus and Strabo. For example, when Herodotus wished to argue that the Colchian people were related to the Egyptians, he said that the Colchians were black, with curly hair. 41. Diop used statements by these writers to illustrate his theory that the ancient Egyptians had the same physical traits as modern black Africans: skin color, hair type. His interpretation of anthropological data, such as the role of matriarchy, and archaeological data led him to conclude that Egyptian culture was a black African culture. In linguistics, he believed in particular that the Wolof language of contemporary West Africa is related to ancient Egyptian. Critique of previous scholarship on Africa. Physical variability of the African people. Diop consistently held that Africans could not be pigeonholed into a rigid type that existed somewhere south of the Sahara, but they varied widely in skin color, facial shape, hair type, height, and a number of additional factors, just like other human populations. In his Evolution of the Negro World in PRA Copyright Sense Africaine, 1964, Diop castigated European scholars who posited a separate evolution of various types of humankind and denied the African origin of Homo sapiens. 43. It is held by Kita et al. That when the data are looked at in toto, without the clustering manipulation and selective exclusions above, then a more accurate and realistic picture emerges of African diversity. For example, ancient Egyptian matches with Indians and Europeans are generic in nature, due to the broad categories used for matching purposes with these populations, and are not due to gene flow. Ancient Egyptians such as the Badarians show greater statistical affinities to tropical African types and are not identical to Europeans. 48. As regards the key Badarian group, a 2005 study by anthropologist Soy Kita of Badarian crania in pre-dynastic Upper Egypt found that the pre-dynastic Badarian series clusters much closer with the tropical African series than European samples. 49. Egypt within the African context. Scholars such as Bruce Trigger condemned the often shaky scholarship on such Northeast African peoples as the Egyptians. He declared that the peoples of the region were all Africans, and decried the bizarre and dangerous myths of previously biased scholarship, marred by a confusion of race, language, and culture and by an accompanying racism. 54. Trigger's conclusions were supported by Egyptologist Frank Urco, who viewed the Egyptians, Nubians, Ethiopians, Somalians, etc. as one localized Nile Valley population. He did not believe that such a population needed to be arbitrarily split into tribal or racial clusters. 40. The Egyptians as a black population. See also, Black Egyptian hypothesis. One of Diop's most controversial issues centers on the definition of who is a true black person. Diop insisted on a broad interpretation similar to that used in classifying European populations as white. He alleged his critics were using the narrowest possible definition of blacks in order to differentiate various African groups such as Nubians into a European or Caucasoid racial zone. Under the true Negro approach, Diop contended that those peoples who did not meet the stereotypical classification were attributed to mixture with outside peoples, or were split off and assigned to Caucasoid clusters. He also stated that opponents were hypocritical in stating that the race of Egyptians was not important to define, but they did not hesitate to introduce race under new guises. For instance, Diop suggested that the uses of terminology like Mediterranean or Middle Eastern, or statistically classifying all who did not meet the true black stereotype as some other race, were all attempts to use race to differentiate among African peoples. Diop's presentation of his concepts at the Cairo UNESCO Symposium on the Peopling of Ancient Egypt and the Deciphering of the Meroitic Script, in 1974, argued that there were inconsistencies and contradictions in the way African data was handled. This argument remains a hallmark of Diop's contribution. As one scholar at the 1974 symposium put it, 56. Diop never asserted, as some claim, that all of Africa follows an Egyptian cultural model. Instead, he claims Egypt as an influential part of a southern cradle of civilization, an indigenous development based on the Nile Valley. While Diop holds that the Greeks learned from a superior Egyptian civilization, he does not argue that Greek culture is simply a derivative of Egypt. Instead, he views the Greeks as forming part of a northern cradle, distinctively growing out of certain climatic and cultural conditions. 62. His thought is thus not the stolen legacy argument of writers such as George James or the Black Athena notions of Martin Bernal. Diop focuses on Africa, not Greece. Cultural unity of African peoples as part of a southern cradle. Diop attempted to demonstrate that the African peoples shared certain commonalities, including language roots and other cultural elements like regicide, circumcision, totems, etc. These, he held, formed part of a tapestry that laid the basis for African cultural unity, which could assist in throwing off colonialism. His cultural theory attempted to show that Egypt was part of the African environment as opposed to incorporating it into Mediterranean or Middle Eastern venues. These concepts are laid out in Diop's Towards the African Renaissance, Essays in Culture and Development, 1946-1960-63, and The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, The Domains of Patriarchy and of Matriarchy in Classical Antiquity. 64-65. These concepts can be summarized as follows. Abundance of vital resources. Gentle, idealistic, peaceful nature with a spirit of justice. Emancipation of women in domestic life. Material solidarity alleviating moral or material misery. Idea of peace, justice, goodness, and optimism. Literature emphasizes novel tales, fables and comedy. Ferocious, warlike nature with spirit of survival. Debasement/enslavement of women. Disgust for existence, pessimism. Literature favors tragedy. Zones of confluence, meeting or mingling area for the two cradles above. Analyses of other scholars, Hiernaus 1975, Kita, 1990 et.al., eschew southern and northern camps and point to a narrower focus that demonstrates cultural, material, and genetic connections between Egypt and other nearby African, Nubian, Saharan, and Sudanic populations. These connections appear not only in linguistics, see languages demonstrating section below, but in cultural areas such as religion. As regards Egyptian religion, for example, there appear to be more solid connections with the cultures of the Sudan and Northeast Africa than Mesopotamia, according to mainstream research. 67. It is doubtful whether Osiris can be regarded as equal to Tammuz or Adonis, or whether Hathor is related to the Great Mother. There are closer relations with Northeast African religions. The numerous animal cults, especially bovine cults and panther gods, and details of ritual dresses, animal tails, masks, grass aprons, etc., probably are of African origin. The kinship in particular shows some African elements, such as the king as the head ritualist, i.e., medicine man, the limitations and renewal of the rain, jubilees, regicide, and the position of the king's mother, a matriarchal element. Some of them can be found among the Ethiopians in Napata and Miro, others among the pre-Nilotic tribes, Shilluk. Languages and African cultural unity. Broad black worldwide phenotype. While acknowledging the common genetic inheritance of all humankind and common evolutionary threads, Diop identified a black phenotype, stretching from India, to Australia to Africa, with physical similarities in terms of dark skin and a number of other characteristics. 95 In an interview in 1985, Diop argued that race was a relevant category and that phenotype or physical appearance is what matters in historic social relations. If we speak only of genotype, I can find a black who, at the level of his chromosomes, is closer to a Swede than Peter Botha is. But what counts in reality is the phenotype. It is the physical appearance which counts. This black, even if on the level of his cells he is closer to a Swede than Peter Botha, when he is in South Africa he will still live in Soweto. Throughout history, it has been the phenotype which has been at issue. We mustn't lose sight of this fact. The phenotype is a reality, physical appearance is a reality. And this appearance corresponds to something which makes us say that Europe is peopled by white people, Africa is peopled by black people, and Asia is peopled by yellow people. It is these relationships which have played a role in history. 96-97. Academic detractors charge Diop with racism, based particularly on his claim that the ancient Egyptians were black. Defenders maintain that Diop's critics routinely misrepresent his views, typically defining Negroes as a true type south of the Sahara to cast doubt on his work. 98 It has been claimed that questions such as "were the ancient Egyptians black?" are typically misrepresented and framed in these stereotypical terms, so as to quickly dismiss his work and avoid engaging it point by point. 98 Diop by contrast in his African Origin of Civilization 99 argues against the European stereotypical conception. He holds that the range of peoples and phenotypes under the designation Negra included those with a wide range of physical variability, from light brown skin and aquiline noses to jet black skin and frizzy hair, well within the diversity of peoples of the Nilotic region. Diop also acknowledged that the ancient Egyptians absorbed foreign genes at various times in their history, the Hyksos for example, but held that this admixture did not change their essential ethnicity. 98. Diop's thought and criticism of modern racial clustering. Diop and the arbitrary sorting of categories. Diop's fundamental criticism of scholarship on the African peoples was that classification schemes pigeonholed them into categories defined as narrowly as possible, while expanding definitions of Caucasoid groupings as broadly as possible. He held that this was both hypocrisy and bad scholarship, that ignored the wide range of indigenous variability of African peoples. 43. Diop and criticism of the Saharan barrier thesis. Diop and criticism of true Negro classification schemes. Such tropical elements were thus in place from the earliest beginnings of Egyptian civilization, not isolated somewhere south behind the Saharan barrier. This is considered to be an indigenous development based on microevolutionary principles, climate adaptation, drift and selection, and not the movement of large numbers of outside peoples into Egypt. 106. As regards living peoples, the pattern of complexity repeats itself, calling into question the merging and splitting methods of Arthur Jensen. ETAL research in this area challenges the groupings used as a. Not reflecting today's genetic diversity in Africa, or b. An inconsistent way to determine the racial characteristics of the ancient Egyptians. Studies of some inhabitants of Gurna, a population with an ancient cultural history, in Upper Egypt, illustrate the point. In a 2004 study, 58 native inhabitants from Upper Egypt were sampled for mtDNA 107. The conclusion was that some of the oldest native populations in Egypt can trace part of their genetic ancestral heritage to East Africa. Selectively lumping such peoples into arbitrary Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, or Caucasoid categories because they do not meet the narrow definition of a true type, or selectively defining certain traits like aquiline features as Eurasian or Caucasoid, ignores the complexity of the DNA data on the ground. Critics note that similar narrow definitions are not attempted with groups often classified as Caucasoid 108. Our results suggest that the Gurna population has conserved the trace of an ancestral genetic structure from an ancestral East African population, characterized by a high M1 haplogroup frequency. The current structure of the Egyptian population may be the result of further influence of neighboring populations on this ancestral population 109. Diop and the African context. In summary, modern anthropological and DNA scholarship repeats and confirms many of the criticisms made by Diop as regards to arbitrary classifications and splitting of African peoples, and confirms the genetic linkages of Nile Valley peoples with other African groups, including East Africa, the Sahara, and the Sudan. This modern research also confirms older analyses, Arkell and Ucko 1956, Shaw 1976, Falkenberger 1947, Struhel 1971, Blanc 1964, ETAL 112. This same modern scholarship, however, in turn challenges aspects of Diop's work, particularly his notions of a worldwide black phenotype. Perhaps Diop's most notable idea is his insistence in placing Nile Valley peoples in their local and African context, drawing a picture of a stable, ancient population deriving much of its genetic inheritance from that context, as opposed to attempts to split, cluster, subdivide, define and regroup them into other contexts. Such a vision of inherent unity and continuity, ironically, is also supported in part by modern mainstream Egyptologists such as Frank Yurko. Thank you and be well.